The tourist, full of self-confidence and convinced that his money gave him the right to do anything, approached the royal guard, spat in his face, and tried to rip the hat off his head. In his eyes, nothing but disdain and mockery. But what happened next shocked everyone. The guard's reaction was so harsh that it made the crowd hold its breath. How did this moment, which began as a pathetic attempt at humiliation, suddenly change the atmosphere around? The continuation will surprise you, but let's start from the very beginning. It was a typical day in London, one of those moments when time seems to stand still. The sky was a dull gray, and the faint hum of traffic echoed in the distance, but in front of Buckingham Palace, the scene was timeless. The royal guard, ever stoic, stood motionless, a living monument to Britain's proud heritage. His red tunic was immaculate, the bearskin hat perched perfectly on his head. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, a model of discipline and duty. To him, this was not just a job, it was an honor, a symbol of Britain itself. The crowds had gathered as they always did, tourists from all corners of the globe, each one with a camera ready, eager to capture their encounter with this icon of British tradition. The air was filled with chatter, laughter, and the sound of camera shutters clicking every second. For many, this moment was the highlight of their trip. But for some, it was just an opportunity to test the boundaries of respect and decency. And there, amidst the throng of visitors, was our antagonist. A loud, brash tourist. A man in his late 30s, wearing a cheap graphic t-shirt that screamed, "I'm on holiday!" and a baseball cap turned backward. His smug grin could have been seen from a mile away. His phone was already in his hand, the camera focused on the immobile figure of the guard, waiting for anything to happen. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the polite murmurs of onlookers who still clung to the belief that these guards were something more than mere entertainers. He stepped right up to the guard's face, his breath reeking of stale beer and fast food. "Hey, smile, mate. You look so serious. Aren't you having fun?" he shouted, in a voice loud enough to make nearby tourists chuckle. He swayed slightly, clearly tipsy from the pub visit earlier that day. The crowd stirred, some people laughing along with him, others looking uncomfortable. Some muttered in disapproval. A few even tried to shush him, sensing the growing tension. But this tourist? He didn't care. He was on holiday, and in his mind, that gave him a free pass to push the boundaries, to make this moment his. The guard remained silent, a stone wall, not a twitch, not a blink. The look on his face was unreadable, but those who knew him would have recognized the discipline behind his expression. To him, this was just another day on duty, another test of character, and there was nothing at all that could break his focus. But the tourist wasn't done yet. No, not by a long shot. This was just the warm-up. "Come on, mate. You're just standing there like a statue," the man called out again, stepping even closer, his phone aimed directly at the guard's face now. The crowd was murmuring more now, some in dismay, others eagerly waiting for something to happen. What was he expecting? A wink? A wave? A smile? It seemed he thought that this guard, this proud representative of British history, was nothing more than an attraction for his amusement. "I'm paying for this, right?" the tourist seemed to think. "This is all just a part of my holiday fun." And that's where the tension began to simmer. The tourist took another step forward, crossing the invisible line that separated him from the guard's space. His foot barely brushed against the white line on the pavement, the sacred line that had stood for centuries as a marker of respect. Tourists had crossed it before, unknowingly, of course, but to do so with such blatant disregard, such arrogance, was something else entirely. A few heads turned. A murmur spread through the crowd, but the guard remained unfazed. His posture was perfect, his eyes unwavering, his hands steady at his sides. Then came the words, the ones no one could ignore. "Hey mate, why don't you do something? It's a bit embarrassing, don't you think?" The tourist sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm paying to see some action, not just stare at a bloke in a funny hat." A few snickers rang out. Some applauded, but underneath it all, there was a growing sense of discomfort. It was as though, for a moment, the crowd recognized the insult beneath the laughter, the quiet but unmistakable feeling that this tourist, this man, was not just testing the guard's patience. He was testing something far more important, the very essence of tradition and respect. It was in that moment, that charged moment of silence, that the guard's steely composure was finally tested. The crowd held its breath. Would he break? The tension in the air was palpable, as if time itself had paused. The guard, ever so slightly, shifted his weight, a small movement that seemed almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but was enough to send a ripple of excitement through the crowd. But that was it. He stood firm. The moment passed. The guard was unbroken, unmoved, and, as he would remain for the rest of his service, an unyielding symbol of tradition. But the tourist wasn't ready to let it go. Oh no, this was just the beginning. And little did he know, the storm he'd just provoked was about to hit him harder than he ever could have imagined. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting a faint golden glow across the plaza, but the air was thick with tension. The tourists, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, continued to mill around, snapping pictures, laughing, and chatting. Yet, the moment that had just passed between the royal guard and the arrogant tourist hung in the air, a foreboding sense of something unsaid, something unresolved. The guard remained as immovable as ever, rigid, focused, his posture a perfect embodiment of British tradition. He had withstood the taunts, the jeers, and the blatant disrespect with nothing more than the slightest shift in stance. To the casual onlooker, it was a mere flicker, hardly noticeable, but to those who knew him, it was the calm before the storm. But the tourist? Oh, he wasn't done. He had thrown his first stone, and now he was eager for a reaction. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Some were still snickering, entertained by his antics, but others began to murmur in quiet disapproval. There was an undercurrent of unease, the kind of discomfort that bubbles up when you realize you're witnessing something that's veering dangerously close to crossing a line. The tourist, emboldened by the growing laughter around him, took another step closer to the guard. His gaze was no longer just a teasing, light-hearted stare. It had become something else, something sharp, malicious, as if he were daring the guard to react. "Come on, mate. Why do you stand there like a statue all day?" he taunted, stepping just a little bit closer. The crowd stilled. The tiny, invisible line between respect and ridicule had been crossed. The white line, the sacred boundary that marked the guard's personal space, was only a few inches away from being breached. The guard's eyes flickered for a split second, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. Not in front of these people. It was a test, and he was determined to pass it. But the tourist wasn't just testing him now. No, he was pushing further, trying to provoke. He reached out a hand, slowly, deliberately, and touched the guard's bearskin hat. The crowd gasped. This was no small thing. The bearskin hat, a symbol of the British monarchy and centuries of history, was sacred. It wasn't just a part of the uniform, it was a living relic. And here was this tourist, this arrogant man, poking fun at it. The disrespect was palpable, and the air grew heavier with every passing second. The guard's expression remained unchanged, but inside, a wave of frustration began to stir. How much longer could he endure this? He had seen it all before. The tourists who thought they could do whatever they wanted, the ones who took pride in pushing boundaries. But this was different. There was something deeper at play now, a challenge to everything he stood for. Still, he stood still. He was trained to withstand such insults. His duty was to maintain composure, no matter the provocation. And, for the moment, he did. But the tourist wasn't done yet. With a mocking grin, he took another step forward and leaned in close. "What? No reaction? Are you even real?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The crowd was shifting now. Some were backing away, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding drama. Others were recording the entire scene on their phones, eager to share it with the world. "Look at this, guys. I'm messing with the guard," one man called out, his voice half laughing, half nervous. But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. The atmosphere was beginning to change. The laughter that once rippled through the tourists now felt hollow, strained. A few whispered among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief. "He's pushing it too far," someone murmured. "What if he makes the guard snap?" The tension thickened. The tourist's bravado was starting to wane, but he didn't know when to stop. His ego, bolstered by the reactions of a few onlookers, had grown far too large. And that's when it happened. The guard, without warning, shifted his weight again, but this time it was not the slight movement from earlier. No, this time it was deliberate, slow, calculated. His shoulders squared, his feet planted firmly on the ground. The tourist, standing dangerously close, felt it, that small but noticeable shift in the guard's stance. He froze for a split second, suddenly aware that he had crossed a line he shouldn't have. The air crackled with the tension of what was about to come. The tourists, who had once been entertained by his antics, now fell silent. They too could feel the gravity of the situation. It was no longer a joke. "Hey, what's with the attitude?" the tourist stammered, now visibly unsure of how far he'd gone. He stepped back slightly, his bravado deflating in an instant. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The guard had held his ground. He hadn't flinched, hadn't reacted, hadn't given the tourist the satisfaction of a rise. But the silent defiance, the rock-solid resistance to the tourist's provocation, spoke louder than any words ever could. And yet, the crowd was still unsure. Would the guard react? Would he speak? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the silence between them stretched on. And that was when it hit the tourist, the moment of realization that he was not dealing with a clown in a funny uniform. This guard, this symbol of Britain's unyielding traditions, was far more than just an object for his amusement. The guard's stoic silence, his unwavering focus, was the real punchline, one that would come back to haunt the tourist in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The crowd was now holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, anything. The tourist's arrogance had backfired, and what had begun as a challenge was now spiraling into something far more serious. What would happen next? Would the guard break protocol? Would he speak? The tension in the air was electric, and everyone, tourists and onlookers alike, were waiting for the next move. And all the while, the guard stood, silent, resolute, defiant. The tourist was about to learn that the true power of the Royal Guard wasn't in their uniforms or their hats. It was in their unshakable resolve, something no amount of provocation could ever break. The tension in the air was thick. What had started as a harmless joke had escalated quickly. The tourist, now feeling emboldened by the crowd, sneered and took another step toward the guard. "Come on, mate, it's just a hat," he taunted, reaching out again to touch the Royal Guard's iconic bearskin hat. But this time, the guard wasn't having it. With a swift motion, he grabbed the tourist's wrist, his grip firm and unyielding. The tourist froze, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. His earlier bravado was replaced by a flicker of panic. The crowd fell silent. Phones stopped filming. The tourist who had been laughing moments ago now looked uncertain. The Royal Guard was no joke. He wasn't here for amusement. He was here to represent something far greater. The tourist struggled to break free, but the guard held him steady, his eyes cold and unwavering. "I suggest," the guard said quietly, "that you leave. You do not touch what is sacred here." The words hit harder than any blow could. The tourist, embarrassed and humiliated, tried to save face but couldn't. His friends were no longer laughing. They were shifting uncomfortably, their excitement gone. The crowd, once unsure, now stood in quiet admiration of the guard's strength and composure. The tourist, his pride shattered, slowly turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. The onlookers, many of whom had been recording, began to murmur in approval. "Good on him," one person whispered. The guard had not just maintained his dignity, he had reminded everyone of the power of respect and tradition. With the tourist gone, the guard resumed his post. His stoic presence had turned a moment of provocation into a lesson in humility. The crowd, now recognizing the value of discipline and honor, returned to their own thoughts, some silently applauding, others simply in awe. The guard had won, and the tourist, though still unaware of it, had lost far more than just a joke.